We're good to go, so it's all good. My name is Ivo Zoer. I'm a field engineer at Unity, and today I'll be talking about improving your workflow with Unity. So why talk on workflow? It's something that's often not being talked about, but can make a really big difference in your productivity and in general make your life a lot easier. So this presentation primarily going to focus on project organization, process, and how Unity can help you with that. So quickly to sum up the goals, the first portion in the talk is a bit generic and goes about team organization and projects. The second topic, go ahead. All right, good. Good? Okay. We're good? I think we're good. I think we're good now. Awesome. What Unity can do to help you organize this, and after that we'll touch on how to use Unity Collab and how we can help there. And last but not least, we're talking about setting up a cache server and Unity work on how you can use the cloud build as well. So you often hear it's never been easier to create games. That doesn't necessarily mean it's easy to create games. While Unity takes care of all the hard stuff, you are still responsible for creating your game and realizing your vision. So no matter what game you're working on, it's always really hard to finish that last 20%, as we call it at Unity. So having a good workflow and process helps you make it a lot easier for you, and hopefully this deck will help you get there. So it's not uncommon, as David already said in the keynote, that teams are scattered all over the place. The upside, of course, is you can work anywhere in the world from your home or whatever. The downside is you can't just walk over and just have a chat with somebody. So the next best thing then is to have something like Slack or Skype or whatever to basically communicate. So if you have people on your team who are working remotely, or you're working remotely yourself, make a point of letting everyone know when you're available. Second, process. That's usually a little bit of a dirty, sometimes a little bit of a dirty word or a bad word, but it can really help your workflow and productivity. So having a process doesn't necessarily mean you can't be creative or spontaneous. It just allows you to be more organized in doing so. So examples of good process would be, if you're working with a team, to send out a daily status update as what you worked on, and if you're doing check-ins, make meaningful comments. Like too often people check stuff in, it's like I made changes, which is kind of useless. Goals and milestones, again, something you can help you get past that last 20%. But be realistic about setting goals, though. It's better to meet your goal late than not at all. Yeah, so they really can help you structure how you go along your game and get things done. So aside from that, for those of you who haven't heard about Unity Connect, it's kind of like LinkedIn for Unity. There's lots of people there who have different skill sets, so being programmers or artists. This is the place to go. So if you're looking for somebody to help you who has Unity experience, you can look at Unity Connect. So people there advertise what they've worked on, what their experience is. And likewise, if you are looking to find work, you can advertise your skills on there as well. So if you haven't been there yet or haven't filled it out, have a look and fill out your profile. All right, so let's get into project organization. So it's super easy to start with Unity, as it doesn't really dictate any structure. Actually, the only thing we have is assets, and the rest is up to you how you structure that. Unfortunately, if you don't have any structure in there and your game gets bigger, it really, really can get out of hand fast. So just like you organize files on your computer for documents and picture everything, you should always create folders inside your Unity project. Well, that sounds pretty straightforward and pretty obvious. Make sure you name your folders properly and spend some time thinking about it. So instead of having just scripts and textures, for instance, it's usually a good idea to go a step further and sit down and schedule out your scene so you know what folders go where, how big your game can be. Assets that are global, for instance, so it's UI, this will be in a higher level so you understand what your flow will be and where your assets will go. One thing to note, if you create folders, actually, the directories you create in Unity actually are also created on the drive, so it's not just project-centric. So setting all this stuff up beforehand as to what your scope of your project is will be a lot easier to figure out rather than do it as you go along. So this is kind of a way of process as well. Asset naming conventions. That's another one. The example here, I don't know if you guys can read it. It has pretty good naming conventions. So rather than having all your idle animations named idle or all your walk animations named walk, make sure you use long file names and long names that is descriptive. So for instance, anim underscore player underscore walk right is a lot easier than trying to find that animation with 400 animations that all are marked as just walk. So the reason for that, like I said, is it's a lot easier to do that, and make sure you get your file names in there so you can make them as verbose as possible, which is a lot easier for you to figure out what's what. Project organization as well. Make sure you can run your game from every scene. By that I mean you basically break it down so that you don't have to build your entire game every time you're testing. With that, you usually end up having to do placeholders or stubbing data, which is maybe a little bit more work, but especially if you're working with other people that work on other scenes, it's really, really handy to kind of be able to just iterate fast on it. Another thing that's useful is make sure you put the floor for a level at the vertical at 0, which basically breaks down your plane in 2D, which is really good for placing objects and for physics and AI as well. So if you have empty objects, your scenes, make sure you put them at the origin and name them appropriately, because if you have a whole bunch of objects and your scene gets really complex, you're not going to be able to figure that out. Last but not least, leverage prefabs as much as you can for everything. When it comes to art, make sure you have the correct scale. Unity treats scale as is basically a meter, whereas some other art packages can have different ones. So make sure you nail that down and document it. While I'm on the topic of documentation, even if you're just working by yourself, make a point of documenting your requirements and why you're doing things. The reason for that is if your team grows, or if you're outsourcing it, it's a lot easier to basically hand them a document that they can work from rather than trying to go over the phone or making stuff up. It becomes tribal knowledge. So one thing I have as an example for myself is I worked at a company that basically had an own custom engine and their own custom workflow for data as well. And yeah, the first day they basically said, here's our API, it's a document, and the second one was, here's the way we process data. And that really allowed me to hit the ground running within a day, which was awesome. Yeah, if you're prototyping and you're waiting on somebody else, use placeholders. I touched on that earlier before. Placeholders can be anything as long as it works. If you want to spend time on it, you can go nuts. If not, just use placeholders that work and are representative. That means if you're working with a team of people, you're not waiting on somebody to finish their thing. And if you then split it up by scenes as well, you can work a lot faster that way. Keeping track of your assets. I'll actually switch back and forth. Whoops. A little bit. This thing keeps keeping me troubles. So out of the box, actually, Unity has a lot of pretty powerful functions, but when I started at Unity, I didn't really find them intuitive or useful, and they're kind of hard to find. So there's three in the project, let me see actually if I can go this. The first one you have is actually types. Going with the three buttons for left to right, and I'll demo this after this here real quick. So types are certain ones that are scripts, animations, and everything. Once you select one, you can see in the toolbox that it actually says T:, whatever the type you have underneath that. So you can actually have searches on, it's basically filtering on different types. So you can filter on be it scripts or meshes or anything. One thing to note, though, is that you can actually lose content if you create wrong combinations. So a script and a mesh is not really possible, so make sure you do that. Another thing to note is that these types are hard-coded. So if you have custom content and you wanted to add that, at this point in time, it's not actually possible to do that. In the future, you might have it, though. Labels. Labels are another way to differentiate files, as you probably know. The cool thing with labels is, though, that you can actually create your own as well. They're kind of hard to find. That's what I found. So in order to add a new label, actually, let me see if I can do this real quick here. I don't know if this... there we are. Oh, I don't see this. This is going to be fun. I didn't expect that. Anyone see my mouse? No, okay. Let me see if I can go back. So I'll do it afterwards in a different one. But so basically, once you click on an asset, you can see in the hierarchy, in the inspector window, right at the bottom, there's a little blue tag. We have a couple of standard tags for that that you can select as well. But it wasn't really clear how you can add custom tags. The way you do that is you actually click in the search box on the top there and type in your name, and it will actually add that right underneath that. To delete a label, you just deselect it from the list, which will automatically also, if there's no other objects to use it, it will actually use it as well, and then actually delete it from that. Favorites, it's kind of like just your browser favorites. Once you have a filter you like to save, you can hit just the star. It will ask you to name the favorite and then add it to the favorite on the left side. Another way you can do it is you can actually drag favorites in there. So you can use either that on folders or collections, but not individual ones. And then the last thing is, if you have a lot of icons, an often overlooked feature is that you can zoom out on icons, so you can have a lot of icons on there. I will actually go back afterwards here and show you what the workflow is like for that. Alphanumeric sorting is another one that's really hard to find. To enable this, you have to go to the preference window and then check enable alphanumeric sorting. We will actually just add a small icon to the drop-down in the hierarchy view as well. So that allows you to sort by alphanumeric order rather than by transform. So if you have a lot of stuff, it's sometimes easier to find things. Again, it's somewhat hidden, but it can be super useful as well. The inspector window, like Mark said earlier as well, there's a tiny little icon which you can lock stuff. The inspector window is dynamic, which means that the contents change based on what you select. If you click on a script, you get different information than you get with, say, a mesh or whatever. The little lock actually allows you to compare stuff. So you can lock one set of properties in your hierarchy window or your inspector window, and then have a second one where you compare that to. Another handy thing is you can label stuff. So if you click on an object, there's another feature where you can label or color as well names for objects. What this allows you to do is actually just have text floating above your object, which is really useful. So any object can be given a label, a color, or both, which is really handy. And another one is really handy for if you're looking at scripts. You can actually pull up the documentation right there by clicking on the icon there. I'll go over this after the demo, so my screen can work. Scene window, if you have a lot of stuff in your scene window, there's another drop-down, which is gizmos. And there's a whole list of there where you can enable or disable basically all the stuff that's there. So if you have a lot of stuff and you want to just disable things so it's a little more decluttered, you have your labels there. You can do that there. The only thing is that it's global, so if you have multiple scene windows open, if you make any change in there, it will do it to all the other windows, which is a little annoying. Preferences, there are actually a lot of stuff there that are hidden. But there's a couple of good ones, like the play mode tint. I don't know if you guys have used that before. It's really easy to distinguish that way. Out of the box, if you just click play, nothing changes. And it's sometimes hard to distinguish whether or not you're in play mode or you're in scene mode. Doing that allows you to get you a bit of a visual identification for that. Another feature that's accessible from preferences is the cache server, which I'll touch on a little bit later. And I talked about the alphanumeric sorting there, where you can find as well. How many people here use source control, version control? Cool. So no matter how big or how small your game or company is, I really, really encourage people to use version control. It's something that's often overlooked because it takes a bit of time to set it up, and it's sometimes a bit of a pain, but it really helps your workflow. So the difference between just making backups or using Dropbox, which actually does have version control in a way that when you drop a file in there, it'll keep a history, but that's about the extent of that. Version control software allows you to record changes over time for different files as well. And you can create branches and label things. And I'll go in a little bit more depth on how this works. But it's really, really useful. And once you get into the flow of things, this is super, super useful. So the way it works is you have a server which can either be on your computer or on a server somewhere else. And the first thing you do is you set up your repository, which is basically your source tree with all your assets and source files on it. And when you do a first commit, which is basically pushing your or writing your files to the server, that becomes what they call the trunk or the head. From that point on, which in this case is one, the green box there, what this basically does is anybody else who gets data from that, it will get that particular version. Now, the cool thing with source control is that you can also create branches. So number 2 and 3 are basically a branch. What that does is it takes the data and then creates a separate branch. At that point, anything you change is not going to affect the source, the number 1, the trunk basically here. So you can make changes, you can check changes back in intermediately. So if you're a programmer, you can do a couple of changes, check it in, but it won't actually affect the other one. So anybody who's new or anybody who gets the data gets the old data, the original one, the unmodified one. So there's already a distinction between who uses what and how you can basically create new features without making other people worry about whether or not their build is stable. So at that point, after 3, he decides to basically push it back and label that. What that does actually, it moves the new version from 1 to 4 and labels it. And what labeling does is basically gives you an easy way to go back to a build. So if you're going to any show, like, or you're going to any demo event, you can label that. So you have your game there, you say, this is the game I want to use. So you can label it and say, this is my game for E3 or GDC, whatever. And at that point, anybody who gets that build can just get that directly from the trunk. So you can go back in time. So that does mean actually you can just continue working without having to worry about branches. I'll go to the other 2 examples real quick. There's 2 more branches, like 5 and 8. That's the branch there. It's kind of the same as 2 and 3 was, with the difference that it's abandoned. And the interesting thing with this is that even though it's abandoned, it's still there. So you could always go back to that particular revision and continue working on that. And if you wanted to, you could actually make it the new branch, the new trunk as well. So 6, 7, and 9 are basically the same as 2 and 3. That it merges it back and labels it as T2. So now at any point, you can go back to any of these branches that are like 1, 4, and 9. But 9 is the most recent version where you basically get, so 9 is somebody comes in new and pulls their context. 9 is what you basically get out of that, because that's the head of that. Oops. All right, I need to label that. So one thing I skipped over was merging and conflicts. What happens when you check something in back to trunk? The first thing actually the server does is it actually grabs the data from the trunk, for what's on the server, and gets the new data. So if there's any file somebody's been working on without working on at the same time, that's what you call a conflict. For text, it's pretty easy. What it usually does is if 2 people have been working in exactly the same area, there's going to be some sort of resolution. The computer doesn't know exactly what to do with it. So you're then going, I want my changes here, and I want the other file's changes there. Usually there's not an issue if you're working on the top of a file or the bottom of it, because there's no conflict there. But if you're both working exactly the same piece of code, you have to resolve that. For binaries, it's a little more difficult because there's no context. If you have one file that's 4 bytes, and there's another file that's 4 megs, there's no way of knowing what changed. Well, you know it's bigger, but anyway. So the advantage of this is that you can't just check stuff in. I mean, if you were to do a Dropbox or anything in there, you're working with multiple people. Somebody just would check something in, and it would be able to break the build, as they call it. So It can still happen, but it's a lot more difficult for people to break their build on that. Assets, I told you about it before. Assets can sometimes take a long time when you pulling data from version control. If you're pulling a particular version, it can take a long time. So what you can do is you can have ignore files where you say, I do not want these particular files to be pulled every time. So it will pull them the first time and then just leave them alone. So if you have assets that you just don't want to change and you know they're not going to change or you don't care about it, you can put it in there. The last thing I'm going to do is, if you're not using version control, just make sure you back stuff up. There's nothing worse than losing like a couple of weeks of work because you did something wrong. So just whichever way you go, back stuff up. Just a recap on version control. Individual branches are great in that you can have specific events. So you can have your source tree, and you know there's going to be a demo up. You create a different branch in there, which is great. Last known good is also an effort where you know that's the build that didn't have any bugs or was running fine. Milestones, of course, is fine, so you can label them and you can go back and tag them. If you have somebody who tests your game, create a test or QA build, which is really, really handy because you always know exactly what the data was he was using, so you can go back on that. And of course, you can use them label or final submission branches as well. Unity has a version control system as well, which is called Collab for collaborate. It's super easy to sign up. All you need to do is visit this link here, sign in with your account, and that will download the beta. After that, you just unzip it, put it in the editor folder, and you'll see a new tab, which I'll show off in a little bit as well, in both the editor and on your dashboard as well on the web. It's currently in beta in any version of 5.5 and upwards, including 2017. It's mainly geared for people up to 15 people, and projects for about up to 10 gigabytes. Underneath the hood, it's based off of Git, and it's free. One note I actually wanted to make is that when you're using version control, it doesn't mean that your source lives on our servers. You always have the source on your own server, and you're always in control of that. The only thing that we store are the changes and the deltas in that. So you still have control over that. You're not losing access to that. Collab, like I said before, once you're in the editor, you can open your project. And the first thing it does is it will guide you through the settings if you click on it. And once it's set up, you can add, either from within Unity or the dashboard, you can add users to it. And then after that, you can see who made changes, who's working on what. Yeah, it will actually show on tags, it will show you who's working on what, which is really good. Then when you're done with whatever you're working on, you can push your changes by just pressing the button and it will push it up. If somebody else made changes, it will actually show up as, it's an orange little button you can get in, and you import those changes as well. So one difference we have between binaries as well, all the binaries that we control, the assets and everything, we actually, for Collab, serialize them as text, so you can merge them a lot easier because we have context now as to what they are. Cache server, I mentioned that earlier a little bit. It's basically a program that continuously checks if assets have been changed and processes them, and basically converts them then. So any files that have been processed basically stay around untouched. And the advantage of this is that it's a lot smoother and faster experience. So rather than whenever you're iterating in your game, you change an asset, you have to rebuild the whole thing. This is basically your program in the background that keeps converting and doing everything. So if you're working with a team, this becomes even more important because if you have a separate server, all of that can be pushed there and everything gets processed there for everyone to share. So there's two ways to set up a cache. Either you have a local one, which is on your machine, or you could have a remote one. Well, technically, you can do both at the same time. If you have an extra machine, a spare one, use that one because it doesn't really tie your machine down and can just keep running and churning stuff out, which is great. So to enable the cache server, start up Unity, launch your project, and then go into Preferences again and click Cache Server. There's 3 states there. It's disabled, local, or remote. Local means you're setting up one on your machine where you're working on, and remote allows you to specify an IP address. So if you want to designate a machine to run the cache server, You could actually download a standalone version as well, so you don't have to install Unity with everything. It's just a standalone that you can put on a machine using a command line, and all it does is basically it looks for changes and it spins, and whenever there's something, it will process it in the background. Host requirements for your cache server depends what you have. If you've got a beefy, if you have money or you have something with lots of memory and fast hard drives, that makes it a lot easier. If you're using it locally, you can as well, and other people can. You can still have a local machine and have other people go in via remote through IP, but then your machine's going to be tied up a lot. So, cloud build is another thing that's really good if you're deploying stuff to different platforms, multiple platforms. So the way this works is that the cloud build system basically monitors your repository and then can automatically build for either one platform or multiple ones, depending on your setting. The nice thing about this is that it actually does it on our service, so it doesn't actually tie down your computer, and it does it in parallel as well. You can even automatically deploy your game as well. So if there's any errors, anything, you'll get an email message. And yeah, you can have different tiers as well of how fast you want to put it out. And everything can be controlled from the Unity dashboard as well. So you can see exactly what our servers are doing, which files they're working on, and which one have deployed them. So there's a lot of information there. To recap, just set up your project beforehand and make sure you have some sort of a strategy to deal with your game when it grows. So it's a lot easier to kind of lay that out, to understand where your game is going. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be set in stone, but it gives you a little bit of an idea as to where you want to go. And it's a lot easier to do it beforehand than doing it afterwards, when you have to rename stuff and juggle stuff around and everything. Process isn't necessarily a bad thing, and by that I mean there's different levels of process. You can go completely nuts and have everything like done, lined out, and create design documents and technical documents. You can do that if you want, but the bottom line is just get to something and stick to it. So sending out status updates if you're with a team, making sure you have a process for documenting things, that if you're outsourcing stuff, you can just hand somebody a document, and that really makes your life a lot easier. And then the last thing is like we have a lot of services in Unity that really help you here. Collab, cloud build, use the cache server. It'll speed up your development cycle a lot. And the last but not least, make awesome games. Let me see if I can get my other thing going here. Now I need to know if I can move around a bit. So I'll show some of these things. It's actually cut off here. So if you click, for instance, on that one, so for labels, you can kind of see it's here. You can pick one of these, but if you want to add an extra one here yourself, you could actually make, like, say we have tank, and that shows up there. So now if you have multiple ones, they will stick around, because if you now click on labels again, you'll see it's right here and it's selected. If other objects also use it, it'll be there, but if I deselect it now, it'll be removed from here, and I click on labels, you can actually see that it's no longer there. The other thing I was talking about was here you can actually have so you can have your tank, you can label it, and you can also change the size on that. I don't know if you can actually see that. Hold on. So here you can change the, let me see if I can, a little difficult to do this way, and my mic keeps falling off. The other thing with the gizmos I talked about, this is a list of all the things you can basically disable and enable. So it really allows you to tailor your scene view for what you want to show and whatnot. Let me see if I can get this. There you go, that's better. So scripts or shell scripts. This is the one thing I talked about here. You can, I don't have internet here. Where you click on here, you basically get references for anything that you select in here. So if you want to look something up here, you can just click on that. And then for collab, I don't know if this works. So basically, this is out of the box. I don't think, maybe I have actually. Let's see what happens. So you can do start now. I don't know if I have internet. There you go. So now I can, so the first time you do that, it says describe your changes here. So you can say first commit everything. So when you do this, so it shows you the files that are all going to be written out. And you can say publish now. What happens then? I don't know, 54 megabytes is going to take a while. You could also, yeah, this is the wrong one here. You can also, if the internet is working, there you go. So yeah, this is the first, once this is done, let me see if this, yeah, it's actually quite fast. There you go. So this is the first one is always longer because there's nothing there. So the second one will be incremental. This will be a lot faster. So now you should see once it's done. And now it turns green as well. So if somebody else does something else, the collab button will turn orange, indicating that there's something else. But it says I'm up to date here. And it says the entire history on the right here. So you can say, doing at 97 assets changed. You can see which ones changed. And then the comment I made here was first commit. You can configure stuff as well. But let me see if I can do this actually here. There you go. That's not it. Don't know if this is going to work. Publish your history. Yeah, basically I don't know if this is going to work. But so you can add people here as well. And then anything that's checked out basically will show, like if somebody's working on a prefab or something else, it will actually show a little label here who's working on that. So yeah, there's a lot of services cloud built here as well that you can distribute automatically outwards. So it's all accessible from here, which makes it really, really simple to control everything. So I think that's all I have. Let me see. Yes, it is. That's it.